The stagecoach wheel hit a rut so deep that Alice Langston's hat flew clean off her head and landed in the lap of a sleeping merchant who did not even stir. And that small indignity, on top of everything else she had endured in the past 3 weeks, was very nearly enough to make her weep right there in front of strangers. She did not weep. She retrieved her hat, straightened the tired ribbon that trimmed its brim, and pressed her nose to the dust-filmed window to watch the town of Caldwell, Kansas materialize out of the flat September prairie like a fever dream. The year was 1878, and the cattle drive still thundered through this part of the territory with enough regularity to keep the saloons full and the jail busy. And Alice had read about Caldwell in a letter written by a man named Gerald Prout, who had advertised in a St. Louis newspaper for a bride of good Christian character with strong hands and a willing heart. She had answered that advertisement on a Tuesday morning when the landlady had slipped a notice of eviction under her door, along with the bill for 2 months of back rent that Alice simply did not have. Her father had died the previous winter, leaving nothing but a coat rack, a Bible with a cracked spine, and a debt to a linen merchant that had consumed the last of the savings Alice thought she had. She was 22 years old, educated in a schoolroom until the age of 16, accustomed to hard work, and entirely without prospects in a city where a woman alone was regarded with either pity or suspicion, sometimes both at once. Gerald Prout had written 2 letters. They were polite and oddly formal, the letters of a man who was perhaps dictating to someone else or copying phrases from an almanac. He described himself as a landowner of 38 years with a good house and a cattle operation outside Caldwell. He said he needed a wife who could manage a household. He did not mention love, but Alice had not expected love. She had expected stability, which was more than she currently possessed. She had sold her good winter coat to buy the stagecoach ticket from St. Louis to Caldwell by way of Wichita, and now that coat was warming someone else's back while Alice sat in her second-best dress, which had a small tear along the left sleeve she had mended twice, but which still showed. She had 14 cents in her purse, the clothes on her back, a carpet bag containing 1 other dress, undergarments, her father's Bible, a hairbrush, and a letter of introduction from the reverend of her church in St. Louis attesting to her character. She was a penniless bride stepping into the unknown, and she told herself very firmly that this was also an adventure, because if she did not call it something hopeful, she thought she might dissolve entirely. The stagecoach pulled into Caldwell at 2:30 on a Wednesday afternoon, and the main street was alive with the particular chaos of a cattle town at the end of the season. There were cowboys still drifting in from the last drives, lean and trail-worn, their horses hitched in long rows outside the saloons. There were merchants and their wives and a couple of women in bright dresses, standing on the upper balcony of a building with a painted sign that Alice chose not to read too carefully. There were children running between wagon wheels and a dog barking at a goat that was eating the corner of a flour sack outside the general store. The driver called the stop, and a man in a canvas apron materialized from nowhere to pull the door open and let the passengers descend. Alice waited her turn, then stepped down onto the wooden boardwalk with her carpet bag clutched to her chest, and she looked up and down the street for Gerald Prout. What she found instead was a cluster of men standing near the water trough, and when the first of them saw her step off the stage with her mended sleeve and her tired ribbon, and her 14 cents of invisible poverty, he said something to his companion behind his hand and both of them laughed. It was not a cruel laugh exactly, but it was not a kind one. It was the laugh of men who recognized a particular kind of desperation and found it entertaining, and within a moment it had spread like a brushfire to 3 more men, and then to a woman in a bonnet who turned to see what was funny, and then hid her smile behind her hand when she assessed Alice's appearance. Alice stood very still on the boardwalk while the heat of embarrassment climbed up her throat and into her cheeks, and she lifted her chin by exactly the degree required to keep her eyes dry, which was a trick she had learned when her father was buried, and the landlady came to pay respects, and also to ask about the overdue rent in the same breath. She turned her gaze forward, refusing to let it drop, and that was when she saw him. He was leaning against the post of the livery stable across the street, one boot crossed over the other, his hat pushed back on his head in the easy way of a man who had nothing to prove to anyone. He was perhaps 28 or 29, tall and broad-shouldered with the particular kind of lean muscle that came from genuine outdoor labor rather than the kind men displayed on purpose. His face was angular and sun-darkened, with a jaw that needed a razor and eyes the color of creek water in October, a kind of gray-green that caught the afternoon light and held it. He was not laughing. He was watching her with an expression she could not immediately name, because she was accustomed to the pity look and the suspicion look and the amusement look, and this was none of those things. It was simply a steady and direct attention, as though he was actually seeing her rather than the fraying ribbon and the mended sleeve and the carpet bag, and when her eyes met his across the dusty width of the street, he straightened up from the post, touched the brim of his hat in a small and genuine salute, and looked away with what appeared to be a complete absence of mockery. Alice noticed this immediately. She noticed it the way you notice a lamp lit in a window on a night when you are walking alone in the cold. She did not have time to think more about it because there was a commotion coming toward her from the direction of the general store, and then a man arrived at her elbow. He was short and red-faced, perhaps 40, with a mustache that seemed to have been grown to compensate for some lack she could not specifically identify. He was sweating through his shirt collar despite the pleasant September temperature, and he looked at her with the expression of a man who had ordered something by mail and was not entirely satisfied with the delivery. "Miss Langston," he said. "That is correct," Alice said, keeping her voice composed. "Mr. Prout, I presume." "Gerald Prout, yes." He looked her over in a way that was neither polite nor discreet. "You're thinner than I expected." "The journey was long," Alice said, because she would not apologize for her own body, not to anyone, not ever. Gerald Prout made a sound that was not quite agreement and not quite acknowledgement and seemed to fall somewhere between the two. "Well," he said, "I suppose you'd better come along. I've got a wagon." He did not offer to take her carpet bag. Alice carried it herself. The wagon was hitched outside the general store, a working farm wagon that smelled of cattle and something else she could not immediately identify. Gerald climbed onto the seat without any particular hurry and waited for her to climb up beside him, which she did, pulling herself up with the grip she had developed from years of hauling laundry baskets and coal buckets in the rooming house, where she had grown up poor in the way that is almost invisible until it suddenly is not. They drove out of town, toward the property Gerald had described as his own, and Alice watched the flat Kansas prairie spread out around them like a khaki ocean, and she asked Gerald sensible questions about the house and the cattle and the nearest church and the schoolhouse for when they had children, all the things a practical woman would ask, and Gerald answered in monosyllables and half-sentences. And by the time the farm came into view, she had a very clear and uncomfortable picture forming in her mind. The house was small in the way that suggested it had once been intended to be larger, and the ambition had run out. It was not falling down, but it was close enough to falling down that it seemed to be giving the matter serious consideration. The cattle operation Gerald had described turned out to be 11 head of beef cattle, and a broken fence that something large had recently walked through. There were 2 ranch hands who looked at Alice with a combination of curiosity and something she could only describe as warning, the look people give when they want to tell you something but have decided it is not their place. That night Gerald Prout sat at the head of a table that was missing one of its 4 legs and was propped up by a brick, and he explained the terms of the arrangement with the warmth and enthusiasm of a man reading a bill of sale. Alice would cook and clean and manage the household. The wedding would occur the following Saturday at the church in town, performed by the Reverend. Gerald expected orderliness and productivity, and he had no patience for sentiment or complaint. Alice sat across from him and thought about 14 cents and a carpet bag, and a coat she had sold in order to arrive here. And she asked in a voice she kept very carefully steady whether she might see the bedroom. The bedroom was a closet with a cot in it that had been added to the main house at a later date, and which shared a wall with the room where one of the ranch hands slept. It smelled of mice and old wool. She went back to the main room and sat down across from Gerald Prout and said, "I have some concerns I would like to discuss with you before we proceed any further." Gerald looked at her from across the propped-up table with the expression of a man who had not expected his arrangement to have opinions, and something shifted in his face that was not quite hostility but was approaching the neighborhood. "I expect you'll settle in once the novelty wears off," he said. "Women always do." Alice opened her mouth to respond to this extraordinary statement, and was saved from whatever she might have said by the sound of hoofbeats outside, and then a knock at the door. Gerald opened it to find a man Alice had never seen before, one of the neighboring ranchers apparently, who needed to speak to Gerald about a matter of a fence line that had been disputed for 2 years. Gerald stepped outside without explanation or apology, and Alice sat alone in the dim room with the propped table and the smell of mice from the bedroom, and she thought with extreme clarity about what she was doing here. She thought about it for a long time. She was still thinking about it when the October sky pressed down on the flat prairie outside the single window, and the lamp on the table guttered in a draft. She thought about the 14 cents. She thought about the fact that she had no return ticket and no address to return to and no coat. She thought about Gerald's look of commercial assessment. She thought about the bedroom that was a closet. And then, unbidden, she thought about a man leaning against a livery post across a dusty street, who had not laughed. The next morning she was up before dawn to light the stove, because whatever else was true, she was not a woman who sat idle, and she found the kitchen in a state that suggested Gerald had been feeding himself exclusively on what could be eaten without preparation for the past several months. She cleaned it methodically and made cornbread and coffee with the supplies she found in the pantry, and when Gerald came to the table he ate without commenting on any of it, which was perhaps the most telling thing she had yet encountered. At mid-morning Gerald said he needed supplies from town and Alice asked if she might accompany him. She said she would like to speak to the Reverend about the ceremony, which was true, but it was not the whole truth. The whole truth was that she needed to think inside a space larger than this house, and she needed to be somewhere that was not this. Gerald said she could come if she could be ready in 10 minutes, and she was. The town of Caldwell on a Thursday morning was quieter than it had been the previous afternoon, but no less alive. Gerald pulled the wagon up to the general store and left Alice to descend on her own again, and went inside to speak to the storekeeper about an account he owed, which Alice gathered from the volume of the storekeeper's greeting was considerably overdue. Alice stood on the boardwalk in the September morning air and thought about what she was going to do. "You look like a woman trying to solve a problem," said a voice near her elbow. She turned, and there was the man from the livery post. Up close he was even more distinctly himself than he had been across the street, which was somehow surprising, as though she had expected the details to be less certain. He was tall enough that she had to look up, with a sun-faded blue shirt rolled to the elbows, and a hat he was currently holding in one hand as though he had removed it without thinking about it, the way a man does when the habit has gone deep enough to be unconscious. "Thomas Bancroft," he said, extending the hand that was not holding the hat. "I've got the rocking bee spread about 3 miles east of town." "Alice Langston," she said, and she shook his hand because she was not a woman who shook hands any other way, firmly and directly, and he looked faintly surprised and then not surprised at all, as though he had adjusted his expectation of her upward in the space of one handshake. "I saw you come off the stage yesterday," he said. He was not apologetic about this, which she appreciated. He was also not smiling in the way people smile when they are thinking about a joke they have already made. "I wanted to say I'm sorry about the way those boys behaved." "That wasn't right." No, Alice agreed. It was not. You here with Gerald Prout. She looked at him with the particular attention of someone assessing how much a question is actually asking. I arrived to meet him, yes. We have a prior arrangement. Thomas Bancroft looked at the door of the general store for a moment, then back at her, and his expression was careful in the way of a man choosing his words with genuine care rather than the kind of care that conceals calculation. I've known Gerald Prout for about 6 years, he said. I won't say anything against a man to a stranger, but if you had questions about this town or about anything, I'd be glad to answer them honestly. Alice looked at him for a long moment. The September sun was warm on the back of her neck, and somewhere down the street a horse was complaining about something with great commitment. Are you a man who answers things honestly, Mr. Bancroft? She asked. I try to be, he said. I'm not always right, but I'm usually straight. That is a better answer than most men would give, she said. Most men say simply yes. Something moved behind his eyes that might have been humor, warm and unpretentious. Well, he said, I figure the ones who say simply yes are the ones you have to watch. She almost smiled at that. She did not quite smile, because her situation was too acute for smiling to sit comfortably. But the impulse was there, and she thought he saw it, and something in his expression settled like a man who has been slightly worried about something and now is slightly less so. Gerald came out of the store then with a face like a man who has had an unsatisfying financial conversation, and he looked at Thomas Bancroft with the particular look of a man who does not want to be seen by the specific person who is currently seeing him. Bancroft, he said, with the warmth of a stone in January. Prout, Thomas said, with the easiness of a man who had not been thinking about Gerald Prout until this moment, and was not particularly troubled by his arrival now. Gerald took Alice's arm in a way that was technically not rough but had nothing gentle in it, and moved her toward the wagon, and Alice went because she was not yet in a position not to go, and she looked back once across the boardwalk, and Thomas Bancroft was watching her with that same steady, attentive look that had no pity in it and no amusement, and was something else entirely that she was not yet ready to name. That afternoon she spoke to Gerald Prout about the terms of their arrangement with more specificity than she had the night before, and she asked about things like access to funds for household expenses, and the legal nature of the agreement they were entering, and what the expectations were for her in terms of labor and time and personal freedom. Gerald answered these questions in a way that made it clear he had never considered that these were things a wife might reasonably expect to discuss, and by the time the conversation ended, Alice had a comprehensive and dismaying picture of the life she was being invited to enter. She lay on the cot in the closet room that night and stared at the ceiling in the dark and engaged in the most serious reasoning she had ever done. On one side of the ledger, she had no money, no return ticket, no friends within 500 miles, no alternative plan. On the other side of the ledger, everything else. She did not sleep until very late. On Friday morning, Gerald left at dawn for what he described as business in the south pasture, and did not say when he would return. And Alice, who had again risen first and started the stove and made breakfast that Gerald had eaten without comment, found herself alone in the house for the first time. She went outside and stood in the September prairie morning and breathed the clean air and looked at the flat immensity of the land around her, and it was beautiful, she thought, in its severe and uncompromising way. It was the kind of beautiful that asked nothing of you and offered nothing back and simply existed, like a fact. She walked. She walked without a particular direction, just away from the house and along the fence line where the grass was tall and dry, and the grasshoppers jumped out of her path like living sparks. She walked for perhaps a mile, thinking, and then she came over a low rise, and there, in the middle distance, was a rider coming along the track that ran between the properties. It was Thomas Bancroft. He was on a dun horse that moved with the kind of easy comfort that speaks to a good relationship between horse and rider, and when he saw her, He raised a hand in greeting but did not immediately change his course, as though he was giving her the option of not being seen, which was a very particular kind of courtesy that she recognized and was grateful for. She raised her hand back. He pulled the horse up and they talked across the fence, and it was the first real conversation she had had since leaving St. Louis, which meant the first conversation in which the other person seemed actually interested in what she was saying. He asked about St. Louis, and she told him about the river, and the way the city smelled after rain, and the theater that she had gone to twice in her life, and considered one of the great experiences of her existence. He told her about coming to Kansas from Missouri 12 years ago with his father, who had died of a fever 5 years past, and how he had built the Rocking Bee up from what his father had started into something he was genuinely proud of. He talked about the land with an affection that was completely unself-conscious, the way you talk about something you love when you are not thinking about how you sound. "Do you like it here?" she asked. "Honestly, I do," he said. He thought about it for a moment in the way of a man who does not say things he does not mean. "It's hard and it's not always kind, but it's real. Everything here is real. The cold is actually cold and the heat is actually hot, and when something goes wrong, there's no pretending it hasn't." "I can see how that would be appealing," Alice said, "to a certain kind of person." "What kind of person are you, Miss Langston?" He asked it directly without guile, looking at her from under the brim of his hat with those October Creek eyes. "I'm finding out," she said. He nodded as though this was a perfectly sensible and complete answer. "How long are you in town?" he asked after a pause. "The wedding is Saturday," she said, and she heard the flatness in her own voice as she said it and did not try to correct it. Thomas Bancroft looked at the horizon for a moment. "Gerald Prout is not a good man," he said quietly. "I said I wouldn't say anything against him, but I find I can't hold to that when it matters." "What kind of not a good man?" Alice asked, because there were many varieties and she needed to know which she was dealing with. Thomas pulled his hat off and turned it in his hands. "He owes money to half the town and has no real intention of paying it. He's had 2 ranch hands quit in the past year because of the way he treated them. The cattle operation he described in his letters, I'd wager, is somewhat more optimistic than the actual state of it." Alice thought about 11 head of beef cattle and a broken fence and a propped-up table. "Yes," she said, "I had arrived at a similar conclusion independently." Thomas looked at her then with an expression she could only describe as respect, direct and uncomplicated, and she felt it settle somewhere in her chest like the warmth from a fire after a long time in the cold. "What will you do?" he asked. "I don't know yet," she said honestly. "I am thinking about it very hard." "For what it's worth," he said, and then he stopped. He started again. "For what it's worth, you don't have to stay somewhere that isn't right for you. There's always another road." "Not without money there isn't," she said, with a precision that was not bitterness but was related to bitterness the way a shadow is related to the thing casting it. He nodded slowly, and there was something in his face that looked like a man turning something over carefully, examining it from multiple angles. Then he put his hat back on and said, "Good morning, Miss Langston," with a courtesy that was not formality but felt like something being placed in safe keeping, and he rode on down the track. Alice walked back to the house and spent the rest of the day in the sort of mechanical productivity that she had learned to use as a substitute for peace of mind. She scrubbed the kitchen floor. She mended a curtain. She went through the pantry and made a careful inventory. She made supper. Gerald came back from the south pasture in a poor mood and ate without speaking, which Alice found she preferred to speaking. Saturday morning arrived in the particular golden way that September mornings have on the prairie, when the light comes in long and flat across the grass, and everything is gilded briefly before the day gets on with its business. Alice put on her better dress and pinned her hair and looked at herself in the small, clouded mirror above the washstand and thought about what she was about to do. She was not going to do it. She had known this for some time, probably since the first night on the cot in the closet, and the knowing had been solidifying steadily through the week, until this morning it was simply a fact. The way the table propped on a brick was a fact, and the 11 cattle were a fact, and the 14 cents were a fact. She could not marry Gerald Prout. Not because he was not handsome or not charming. Those were simply additional conditions of the situation. But because she had been poor her entire life in St. Louis and had managed to maintain her dignity and her self-possession, and a certain quality of spirit that she had come to understand was worth something, was perhaps worth more than anything else she possessed. And she knew with absolute certainty that 6 months in Gerald Prout's house would take those things from her with the same indifference with which the mine takes the ore out of the rock. She would not let that happen. The practical problem was the remaining 14 cents and no coat and no ticket and no plan. She was thinking about this at the kitchen table when she heard hoofbeats in the yard, and she looked out the window, and it was Thomas Bancroft on the dun horse, and sitting beside him on another horse, a bay mare, was a woman perhaps 10 years older than Alice with a capable face and red hair pinned under a sensible hat. Alice went to the door. "Morning, Miss Langston," Thomas said, and he looked at her with the kind of care a person takes when they are uncertain how something is going to land. "This is my housekeeper, Mrs. Abigail Cooper. She's been with me at the Rocking Bee for 4 years. Abigail Cooper looked at Alice with the frank appraising look of a capable woman who takes measure quickly and acts accordingly. "Good morning," she said. "I understand you're in a situation." Alice looked from one of them to the other. "Yes," she said, "I believe I am." "Thomas told me," Abigail said without apology, because she was not the kind of woman who apologized for practical action. "We have a proposal if you'll hear it." Alice stepped out of the doorway and leaned against the porch post and said, "I am very much in the business of hearing proposals this week," which was perhaps the closest she had come to a joke since the stagecoach, and Abigail Cooper looked at her and then gave a short, warm laugh. The proposal was this: the Rocking Bee needed a school teacher. There were 6 children on neighboring properties, including the Cooper children, who were reaching the age where schooling was becoming urgent, and there was no schoolhouse or teacher within reasonable distance of the East properties. Thomas Bancroft was willing to convert one of his outbuildings into a schoolroom if someone was willing to teach in it. He was also willing to offer room and board in the main house, in a proper bedroom, in exchange for the teaching. "This is not charity," Thomas said clearly, looking at her. "The teaching is real work and the pay is fair. I've spoken to the neighboring families and they can contribute between them enough to make it a proper wage. But I wanted to speak to you first, before we made any other arrangements." Alice looked at him for a long time. She looked at the way the September morning light lay across the yard and the flat land beyond, and she thought about Gerald Prout asleep in his room with the propped-up table in the next room, and the closet bedroom, and the 11 cattle. "I have one question," she said. "Was this offer made because you felt sorry for me or because you actually need a teacher?" Thomas met her eyes without hesitation. "I need a teacher," he said. "The sorry part is entirely secondary." "Then yes," Alice said. "I accept." She had her carpet bag in her hand within 10 minutes. She left a note for Gerald on the propped-up table, written in her clear and schoolmistress-worthy hand, informing him that she had reconsidered the arrangement and would not be proceeding with the marriage, that she hoped he would be able to find a more suitable match, and that she was sorry for any inconvenience. She considered this more courtesy than the situation strictly required, but she extended it anyway, because she was not Gerald Prout, and did not intend to become the kind of person who left notes without courtesy. She rode the bay mare into the morning with Thomas Bancroft on one side and Abigail Cooper on the other, and something in her chest that had been drawn up tight like a fist for 3 weeks began, very slowly, to open. The Rocking Bee spread was everything Gerald Prout's operation aspired to be, and had not achieved. It was 3 miles east of town, along a road that was rough but passable, and when it came into view around a curve of the track, Alice felt the particular catching sensation of recognizing something before you have a name for why it is familiar. The main house was a solid, well-built structure with a covered porch all the way around, and there were outbuildings in good repair, and a barn that was painted red, which she had heard people did in the East but had not expected here. And there were probably 150 cattle visible from the track and more behind the hill. And there were 2 ranch hands in the yard who greeted Thomas with the easy directness of men who were well treated by their employer. Her room was in the east corner of the house, with a window that looked out over the prairie, and it had a proper bed and a washstand with a pitcher that was not cracked, and a small writing desk that she thought she might love with a disproportionate intensity, given that it was a very small and ordinary writing desk. "Abigail will show you around," Thomas said at the door. "Whenever you're settled, there's no rush on anything. The schoolroom is something we can work on over the next few weeks." "I would like to start on Monday," Alice said, "if the children are available." Thomas Bancroft looked at her with that expression that was not surprise but was a kind of clear-eyed appreciation. "Monday it is," he said. Over the next days something very particular began to happen to Alice Langston, which was that she began to exhale. Not all at once, because she was 22 years old and had been holding her breath for most of the last 2 years, and the habit of tension does not leave quickly. But she exhaled in increments, in the way a room warms up slowly from a single fire, and the increments were things like eating a meal without watching another person's face for signs of displeasure, and going to sleep in a proper bed without the sounds of mice behind the wall, and waking up knowing that the day ahead was her own to navigate rather than something she was being pushed through. She was discovering, very good at teaching. The schoolroom, which Thomas and his 2 ranch hands converted from a storage shed with efficient and cheerful speed over the first week, accommodated 7 children ranging from 6 to 13 years of age. There was Me Cooper, Abigail's daughter, who was 11 and terrifyingly smart, and had the habit of reading ahead in every book Alice presented, and then waiting with barely concealed impatience for the slower children to catch up. There was Robert and Henry Dawes from the neighboring Dawes property, 8 and 10 respectively, who were deeply attached to each other, and to the concept of not doing schoolwork, but who could be reliably motivated by any subject that involved animals or mechanisms. There was little Clara Bishop, 6 years old and newly arrived from Ohio with her family, who was sweet and diligent and cried at almost everything including compliments, which Alice learned to deliver with special gentleness. There was Sam Dillon, 12, who had the kind of mathematical mind that made Alice want to write to every educator she had ever met and say that this child needed resources she was not certain she could provide. And there were the 2 Carson girls, 9 and 13, named Ruth and Josephine, who had their own private communication that seemed to operate slightly outside the range of adult comprehension. Alice taught them reading and arithmetic and some history and a great deal of geography, because she had a personal feeling that children who understood where they were in the world understood themselves better, and she told them about the rivers and the mountains and the cities and the oceans. And the children who had never been further than 50 miles from where they were born looked at the rough maps she drew on the small blackboard Thomas had acquired from somewhere, and their eyes went wide with the particular hunger that good teaching creates. Thomas would sometimes lean in the doorway at the end of the afternoon when the children had gone home, not intruding, just present, and Alice would look up from wiping the blackboard and find him there, and they would often stand and talk in the blue September, and then October light about the day and the children and whatever else came naturally, which was increasingly a great many things. He was not a man who talked to fill silence. He talked when he had something to say, and what he had to say was generally worth hearing, and this was such an unusual quality that Alice found herself listening for it the way you listen for a particular bird you have only just learned exists. He told her about building the rocking bee, about the years after his father died when the place was close enough to failing that he had gone 3 winters without replacing his own boots because the cattle needed feed more than he needed dry feet. He told her about the longhorn drives when he was younger, making his first wages on other men's cattle, sleeping on hard ground and eating food that was approximately food, and about the feeling when he finally had enough to buy his first parcel of his own land, which he said he had sat on in the middle of a field at midnight just to feel it beneath him. Alice told him about St. Louis, about her father who had been a clerk and a gentle man who read to her every night from whatever he had, and who had taught her that books were the one kind of wealth that could not be repossessed. She told him about the years of careful poverty, of making things last and stretch and do double duty, and about the Reverend's wife who had taught her arithmetic out of kindness, and who had said that a woman with numbers in her head could always find her feet. She was right, Thomas said. She was, Alice agreed. I wish I had been able to tell her how right. The people who help us the most don't always get to know it, Thomas said. No, Alice said. That's one of the genuine sadnesses. He looked at her from across the small table in the schoolroom where they were sitting in the October evening, and there was a particular quality to the silence that followed that Alice noticed with a clarity she could not quite account for. It was the silence of two people who are both aware that something is happening between them, and are both being careful with it, because it is the kind of thing that can be frightened off by being too direct too soon. Gerald Prout had not taken Alice's note quietly. That was the other thing that had happened in those first weeks, the complication she had partly anticipated. He had come to the rocking bee on the Sunday after she left, in a state of considerable agitation, and he had spoken to Thomas in the yard with the volume of a man who believed that speaking more loudly made him more correct. Thomas had listened to him with extraordinary patience, and then told him that Alice Langston was employed at the rocking bee and was not going anywhere unless she chose to, and that he would appreciate Gerald keeping a civil tone. Gerald had not kept a civil tone. Gerald had said several things about Alice that were the particular kind of things men say about women who do not do as expected, things that were designed to reduce her in the estimation of anyone listening. And Alice had heard this from the porch where she had been standing with Abigail Cooper, and she had walked down into the yard and looked at Gerald Prout with the full collected force of her attention, and said, clearly and without raising her voice, that she had provided written notice of her withdrawal from their arrangement before any legal or ecclesiastical proceedings had occurred, that no binding contract had been entered, and that she would thank him not to speak about her in terms she found objectionable. Gerald had looked at her with the expression of a man who had been expecting a flower and received a bayonet instead, and then he had looked at Thomas, who was watching Alice with an expression of barely contained admiration and no willingness whatsoever to intervene on Gerald's behalf. And then Gerald had driven his wagon back toward town with significantly less noise than he had arrived with. Abigail Cooper had squeezed Alice's arm very briefly in the way of a woman who recognizes a particular quality in another woman and is glad to encounter it, and then gone back to the kitchen to see about the evening meal. Thomas had come to stand beside Alice in the yard after Gerald's wagon disappeared, and he had said, "You didn't need any help from me." "No," Alice said, "but it mattered that you didn't offer it when I didn't need it." She paused. "Some men would have spoken for me anyway." "That would have been an insult to you," Thomas said simply, "dressed up as assistants." She had looked at him then with the full and direct attention that she gave to things she was taking seriously, and he had met it, and neither of them had looked away. In November the first cold came down from the north, and the prairie changed from gold to iron, and Alice found that she loved the Kansas winter with the same complicated affection she was developing for everything else about this place. She loved the way the cold sharpened the edges of things and made the fire inside more precious, and she loved the way the cattle moved in the early morning across the frosted grass with their breath clouding white, and she loved the way the stars over the flat land had no buildings to compete with them, and so they simply occupied the entire sky from horizon to horizon, in a display that she had stood on the porch watching on more than one occasion until her toes were numb. Thomas found her there one of those nights, standing at the porch rail with her shawl wrapped tight, looking up. "You'll freeze," he said, but there was no reproach in it, only a kind of warm concern that he offered without making much of it. "In a moment," she said. "Look at them." He looked up. "I know," he said. He stood beside her at the rail, close enough that she could feel the warmth from him in the cold air, not touching, just present. "My father used to say that any man who could look at that sky and think he had it all figured out was either a fool or a liar." "Your father sounds like he was worth knowing," Alice said. "He was the best man I ever met," Thomas said, without sentimentality, just simply, "the way you state a fact you have lived with long enough to stop needing to justify." Alice thought about her own father, the gentle clerk who had read to her by lamplight, and she thought about how the two of them, Thomas's father and her own, had shaped the people standing here on this porch in the cold Kansas dark, and she thought that was a remarkable thing, how the dead continue to reach forward through us into the present. "My father would have liked you," she said, before she thought about whether to say it. Thomas turned his head to look at her. She kept her eyes on the stars, but she felt his attention the way you feel the warmth from a fire when you turn toward it. "I think I would have liked him," Thomas said quietly. The school was going beautifully. Sam Dillon's mathematical ability was a problem Alice had solved in the way her reverend's wife had once solved it for her, by finding him more advanced material. She had written to a teacher in Wichita she had met briefly during the stopover on her journey west, and the teacher had sent back 3 books that were significantly beyond Sam's year, and the expression on Sam's face when she handed them to him was one she thought she would carry with her for the rest of her life. Me Cooper read so far ahead that Alice had taken to having a private reading hour with her each week, where they discussed things the younger children were not ready for, which Me accepted with the grave pleasure of a child who has been waiting for someone to take her seriously. Clara Bishop stopped crying at compliments mostly around mid-November, and instead produced a smile of such devastating sweetness that Alice thought several times that this child was going to be a remarkable person, and that the world had better be ready for her. The Dawes boys remained committed to not working unless the work involved something alive or mechanical, so Alice had simply restructured the curriculum to involve more of both. She taught arithmetic through the management of hypothetical cattle herds and geometry through the mechanics of wagon wheels and windmills, and Robert and Henry Dawes were, by December, the most arithmetically capable 8- and 10-year-olds in the county, though she had no data to support this claim, and made it entirely on the basis of her own conviction. Thomas watched all of this with the particular admiration of a man who had made a decision and been confirmed in it repeatedly. He said nothing more than was appropriate for an employer, and Alice said nothing more than was appropriate for an employee, because both of them were being careful with the thing that was growing between them, which was real and substantial and required care. It was Abigail Cooper who said something first, which surprised neither of them given that Abigail was a woman who had strong opinions about people wasting time. She came to Alice one December morning when the ground was frozen and said, over the breakfast table after Thomas had gone out to the cattle, "That man has been in love with you since the day you got off the stagecoach." Alice put down her coffee cup. "That is a considerable thing to say." "I know," Abigail said pleasantly. "It's also true. He has not said anything," Alice pointed out. "Because he's decent," Abigail said, "and he thinks you've been through a difficult time and doesn't want to add to it by asking you to decide something while you're still finding your footing." She cut a piece of bread. "He's wrong about the timing, in my opinion, but the decency is real." Alice looked at the table for a moment. "And what do you think I feel?" she asked, which was perhaps a strange question to ask, but she found she wanted an outside view. Abigail looked at her with the expression of a woman who finds some questions delightfully obvious. "I think," she said carefully, "that you noticed him immediately, which you have never exactly denied, and that you have been noticing him consistently ever since." Alice looked out the kitchen window at the frozen prairie. "Yes," she said after a pause, "that is accurate." "Well then," Abigail said, with the satisfied finality of a woman who considers the matter substantially resolved, Someone is going to have to say something to someone, and I personally find waiting uncomfortable to witness." She said this last part with enough cheerfulness that Alice laughed, which was a complete and genuine laugh that she gave freely, and Abigail laughed with her. And the kitchen was warm, and the bread was good, and the frozen prairie outside was silver in the December morning light. That evening, Thomas came to the porch after supper, as he had taken to doing more evenings than not, and they stood in the cold and talked. And at some point in the conversation, there was one of those silences that has a particular quality, a fullness rather than an emptiness. And Alice looked at the man beside her, at the strong and honest profile of him against the winter sky, and she thought about a stagecoach stopping in a dusty street, and a circle of laughter and one person who did not laugh. And she thought about how much had happened since then and how all of it had led to this porch and this moment, and she said, "Thomas." He turned. "Yes." "I have been thinking," she said, "about what I might have thought of this place if I had come to it differently. Not on a stagecoach with 14 cents and a plan that collapsed, but by choice, with time and intention." "And what would you have thought of it?" he asked. "I think I would have loved it," she said. "I think I would have seen the sky and the land and the school and the people, and I would have thought, here is a place that is worth something real." He was watching her with complete attention and complete stillness. "And I think," she said, "that I would have noticed you, in exactly the way I did notice you, which was immediately and without any particular preparation." The silence that followed was the kind that has weight and warmth. "Alice," Thomas said, and her name in his voice was a thing she had not been expecting, not the simplicity of it, the way he said it as though it was just her name and also something more. "I would like to tell you something if you'll hear it." "Yes," she said. "I have been half in love with you since you looked across that street and refused to look down," he said. "Not from pity. Not from the habit of courtesy to a woman in a difficult situation, although both of those things are also true, but because I saw something in you that day that I have been watching ever since, and it is the most—" He stopped. He started again. "You are the most remarkable person I have met in my life, and I am aware that is a large thing to say, and I mean all of it." Alice felt the cold air on her face and the warmth of the man beside her and the vast and indifferent sky above and the real and particular ground beneath her feet, and she thought about what it meant to find something true after a long time of things being uncertain, and she said, "I am half in love with you too. Rather more than half, if I am being precise about it." Thomas Bancroft reached out and took her hand, carefully, the way you take something that matters, and she let him. And they stood on the porch in the December dark, and it was not dramatic or theatrical, but it was entirely, completely real. He kissed her for the first time that night at the door when they came in from the cold, a brief and gentle kiss that was simultaneously a question and a statement and a beginning. And she kissed him back in the full knowledge of what she was doing, which was the only way she did anything. Christmas came to the rocking bee with a depth of cold that seemed to Alice almost festive in its extremity, and she threw herself into the celebration with the enthusiasm of a woman who had spent several lean Christmases being practical about what could not be afforded, and now found herself in a place where abundance was possible. She made things in the kitchen with Abigail for days beforehand, and she decorated the schoolroom with cedar branches that Thomas brought in, and she arranged for the families of her students to come together on Christmas Eve for a gathering that involved the children performing a small recitation they had been rehearsing for 2 weeks. The children were magnificent. Even Robert Dawes, who had expressed in clear terms his opinion of public speaking, performed his recitation with a gravity that suggested he had decided to take the thing seriously on his own terms and was executing it accordingly. Mee Cooper was flawless and knew it. Little Clara Bishop forgot one line, looked directly at Alice with an expression of pure alarm, was given the gentlest possible nod of encouragement, and found the line and delivered it with extraordinary composure for a 6-year-old. Sam Dillon did something none of them had planned, which was that he stood up after his recitation and said, very quietly, that he wanted to thank Miss Langston for the books, and for seeing what he could do with them, and the room was briefly silent in the particular way of a room full of people who have just been moved by something genuine. Alice looked at that boy and his quietly burning mathematical mind, and thought that, wherever Sam Dillon ended up in this world, she was very glad to have been a few months' worth of the journey. After the gathering, when the families had gone home in their wagons through the frozen night, Thomas found Alice in the schoolroom taking down the cedar branches to put them in water overnight so they would last another day. He came and helped her with this simple task, handing things down from where they were hung and passing the bucket, and in the warm quiet of the schoolroom he said, "Will you allow me to speak to you about something more permanent?" Alice looked at him. "More permanent than what currently exists." "Than being employed," he said, "and being someone I stand on the porch with in the cold and try to find the right words for." She set down the cedar branch she was holding. "Thomas," she said, "I came to Kansas to be married. It is perhaps the central irony of my situation that the marriage I came to enter was wrong, and the man I am standing in a schoolroom with on Christmas Eve appears to be right, but I have never been opposed to irony." Thomas Bancroft had the expression of a man who is in the process of being extremely happy and has not quite caught up with the fact of it. "Is that a yes?" he said. "That is a very emphatic yes," Alice said, "and the only thing I require is that you ask me properly." He did. He stood in the schoolroom with the cedar branches in water and the cold outside, and the stars indifferent and vast above the Kansas plain, and he asked Alice Langston to marry him with a simplicity and a directness that was entirely consistent with the quality of the man as she had come to know him. And she said yes, properly this time, and he held her face in his hands and kissed her in the way of a man who intends to mean it for the rest of his life. The wedding was in January, on a Saturday, at the church in Caldwell, where Alice had been meant to be married in October. The reverend who performed the ceremony was a large and warm-spirited man named Reverend Hargrove, who shook Thomas's hand with both of his and told Alice that she was getting the best man in the county, which Thomas accepted with a slightly embarrassed humility that Alice found completely endearing. The women of the town who had been among those who laughed in October attended the wedding in their good dresses and with their best manners, and Alice acknowledged them with the grace of a woman who has decided that the best response to past unkindness is present dignity, which is a kind of victory that requires no confrontation. The exceptions were 2 or 3 women who came to speak to Alice directly and with what appeared to be genuine contrition, and Alice accepted this with warmth, because she was not a person who held fences when gates were being offered. Gerald Prout was not at the wedding. He had, according to the rumor Abigail Cooper brought in from town, with the efficiency of a woman who kept her ear to the social ground as a professional courtesy, left Caldwell 2 weeks prior with his remaining cattle, his debts, and his propped-up table in the direction of no specific destination. Alice wished him no particular ill and expected no particular good, and she thought about him approximately in the way you think about a detour on a road journey. It was not the path you planned, but it led you somewhere real. The wedding supper was held at the Rocking Bee and included the families of all 7 of her students, plus the 2 ranch hands, whose names were James and Patrick, and who had the good manners and general decency that Thomas evidently required of the people around him, and Abigail Cooper, who was the emotional and logistical center of the whole evening, and whom Alice already loved in the way you love someone who chose to help you before you could earn it. Thomas danced with Alice twice in the cleared-back sitting room while Patrick played the fiddle, and he danced the way he did most things, with a focused competence and genuine pleasure. And at the end of the second dance, he held her hand for a moment longer than was strictly required, and looked at her with everything he felt entirely legible on his face. And she thought that she had been 22 years old and penniless and frightened, and that life had arranged things with a precision she could not have invented and did not need to understand, only to be grateful for. Spring came to the rocking bee and to their marriage simultaneously, which Alice thought later was a timing so symbolic as to be almost theatrical. But the prairie did not concern itself with symbolism and simply bloomed because it was that time of year. The grass came up green, and then greener, and the wildflowers appeared in the lower pastures in quantities that made the land look as though someone had scattered colored paper across it. And Alice took her students outside for their lessons on the days that permitted it. And they learned arithmetic among the flowers and history sitting on the grass and geography looking at the actual horizon, which she had come to believe was the best possible way to understand that the world was large. Thomas was building the rocking bee steadily, and with the methodical intention of a man who thought in decades. He was adding cattle to the operation, negotiating for an additional parcel of land to the south that would give them water rights on a second creek, and managing everything with the quiet competence that had built the place in the first instance. He spoke to Alice about all of it, not because he needed her permission but because he valued her thinking, and she had ideas about the land and about the business that surprised him sometimes, and that he consistently took seriously, which she thought might be the most romantic thing about him, which was saying something given the competition. They spent evenings together at the kitchen table after Abigail had gone to her quarters, and the ranch hands were settled, Thomas with his account books and Alice with her lesson planning or her reading, both of them in the same warm circle of lamplight, talking when something came up and not talking when it didn't. And Alice thought more than once that the particular quality of this shared quiet, was a thing she had not known to want and would now not know how to be without. In June, 6 months after the wedding, Alice discovered she was expecting a child. She told Thomas on the porch in the evening, which had become their place for important things, and he went very still for a moment, and then turned to look at her with an expression she had no word for, which was perhaps because the feeling it expressed was too large for a single word and required several at minimum. And he said her name again in that way he had. And then he said, "Alice." And then he said nothing at all for a moment because he appeared to be past words. And then he held her hands and pressed them briefly to his lips, which was not something he had done before, and which undid her entirely in the best possible way. He was careful with her in the months that followed in the way of a man who understood that careful was not the same as limiting, that you could take care of something and still let it be fully what it was. He did not suggest she stop teaching, which she would have refused anyway, because she taught until September when the journey out to the schoolroom was no longer comfortable, and then she brought the schoolroom to the house, teaching the children in the rocking bee parlor until she could return to the converted shed, which Thomas quietly furnished with a rocking chair for her while she was not looking, and said nothing about it until she found it one morning, and looked at him across the schoolroom with an expression that required no translation. The baby came in the first week of November 1879, which was a year and a month after Alice had stepped off the stagecoach in Caldwell with 14 cents and a carpet bag, and which fact she had occasion to appreciate with some precision, because the contrast was not something she was inclined to forget. The baby was a boy. He was dark-haired, which was Alice's contribution, and had eyes that were unclear in color in the way of new babies, and resolved themselves over the following weeks into the gray-green October creek of his father's, which Alice considered an extraordinary and unreasonable act of favoritism on the part of the universe toward Thomas Bancroft. They named him James William Bancroft, the first name for one of the ranch hands who had been unfailingly decent to Alice from the day she arrived, which made James the ranch hand visibly moved in a way he was clearly uncomfortable with, and which endeared him to Alice even further, and the second name for Thomas's father, which Thomas accepted with a brevity that told her everything about what it meant to him. James William Bancroft was a calm and watchful baby who seemed to share his father's preference for paying attention before speaking, and who achieved all his milestones with the quiet competence that Alice was beginning to recognize as a Bancroft characteristic. He was adored by Abigail Cooper, who had 3 children of her own and apparently considered one more to be an addition rather than an imposition, and he was regarded with intense scientific curiosity by Sam Dillon, and with unconditional emotional enthusiasm by little Clara Bishop, who asked Alice every school day how the baby was, and who, at her first opportunity, gazed at him for so long and so raptly that Alice thought he might be the first thing Clara had not cried about from pure feeling. Me Cooper, being 11 and therefore in command of the most complicated emotional landscape of anyone in the schoolroom, loved the baby with a fierce and private intensity and would have denied it completely if asked, which Alice recognized and respected and never asked about. The school continued and grew. By the spring of 1880, there were 2 more children enrolled, the Hartley children from a new family who had come in from Nebraska, and Alice found herself teaching 9 students in a space that was becoming somewhat ambitious for one person, and she wrote to Wichita, and then to a teacher's college she had read about, and she found a second teacher, a young woman named Dorothy Marsh, who arrived from Missouri in April with a degree and a practical manner, and an evident enthusiasm for exactly the kind of work Alice was offering. The 2 of them divided the students by age and worked in complementary shifts, and the results, Alice thought with satisfaction, were better than either of them could have achieved alone. Dorothy Marsh was also 23 years old and newly arrived, and in need of a friend, which Alice understood from personal experience, and she extended to Dorothy the same practical and unassuming welcome that had been extended to her at the Rocking Bee 16 months before, and was rewarded with a friendship that proved both warm and durable. In 1880, Thomas secured the water rights on the South Creek and expanded the cattle operation to a size that required the hiring of 2 additional ranch hands, men named Cole and Marcus, who came with solid references and proved their worth in the first season. The Rocking Bee was now a genuinely substantial operation, and Thomas managed its growth with the same careful and purposeful thinking he brought to everything, which meant it grew at the pace of sustainability rather than the pace of ambition exceeding capacity. Alice managed the household and the school and participated in decisions about the ranch with the partnership Thomas had offered from the beginning and had never in the time since diminished. She kept accounts and read contracts and had opinions about cattle prices and feed costs that were based on careful attention to information, and Thomas said more than once that the Rocking Bee was better run because of her, which she knew was true, and which she also knew he meant as more than a business compliment. There were difficulties, as there are in all real things. There was a winter in 1880 that was brutal enough to take 20 head of cattle and to leave Thomas's face set in the particular hard line of a man absorbing a significant loss, and Alice sat beside him at the table while he worked through the revised accounts, and she did not offer false comfort, which he would have seen through, but simply stayed with him in the difficulty, which was what he needed. There was a dispute with a neighboring rancher over the east fence line that went on for the better part of 6 months, and that Thomas navigated with more patience than Alice thought was strictly available from finite human reserves, and which was eventually resolved in their favor by a surveyor whose measurements were incontrovertible. There was the matter of Sam Dillon. In the fall of 1880, Sam was 13, and he had consumed everything available to him in the eastern Kansas school system, and was in danger of the particular fate of exceptional young people in places where the exceptional has no room to go, which is that the exceptional simply turns inward and eventually diminishes from lack of space to expand into. Alice wrote 5 letters. She wrote to the teachers' college. She wrote to an educational organization in Kansas City. She wrote to a mathematics professor in St. Louis whose name she had found in a journal, and she wrote to 2 wealthy men whose names she had heard associated with charitable education causes. The 5th letter, to the mathematics professor in St. Louis, produced a response 3 weeks later that was, she thought, one of the finest pieces of news she had ever received. The professor had a connection to a school in Kansas City that accepted students on scholarship who demonstrated exceptional mathematical aptitude. He was willing to evaluate Sam's work and recommend him if the work supported it. Alice copied out Sam's 3 years of increasingly advanced work by hand, in her clearest writing, and sent it with a letter that was the best piece of persuasive writing she had ever produced. Sam was offered the scholarship in December. She told him in the schoolroom quietly after the other students had gone. Sam Dillon read the letter twice and then sat very still for a long time and then looked at Alice and said, with the directness of a boy who had always spoken exactly as much as the situation required and no more, "I don't think I would have been seen without you, Miss Langston." Alice said, "You would have been seen eventually, Sam. The world tends to find things of genuine quality." "You found it first," he said, and then he folded the letter with great care and put it in his coat pocket and went home, and Alice sat in the schoolroom alone for a while in the December quiet and felt the quiet, cumulative satisfaction of having done a thing that mattered. She told Thomas that night. He listened to the whole story, the letters and the professor and the scholarship, and at the end he said, "You did that," in a way that was not about taking credit for himself but about making sure she took credit for herself. "I saw a child who needed a different kind of attention," she said. "That was not difficult to do. For you it wasn't," he said. "That's the thing you don't always see about yourself." She looked at him across the kitchen table in the lamplight, at the man who had stood against a livery post on a dusty street and not laughed when everyone else was laughing, and she thought about the quality of being seen and what it meant, and how it traveled outward through the people who experienced it. Sam Dillon with his scholarship, Clara Bishop with her composure, Me Cooper with her private ferocity, herself with her teaching and her school and her life here on the flat and magnificent Kansas plain. "Thomas," she said, "yes, you saw me first on that street, that matters." He reached across the table and took her hand in the easy, unhurried way of a man who had been doing this long enough that it was as natural as breathing, and he said, "You made it very easy to see." The second child came in 1882, a girl this time, born in April when the prairie was achieving one of its more spectacular productions of wildflowers, and they named her Eleanor, which had been Alice's mother's name, a woman who had died when Alice was 7, and of whom she had only the most fragmentary and precious memories, a singing voice and warm hands and the smell of lavender water. Thomas Bancroft arrived with an opinion that she communicated at high volume, and then abruptly did not need to communicate at all, because everything was immediately satisfactory, and she went asleep. James, who was 2.5, accepted his sister with the focused pragmatism of a Bancroft, observed her carefully for several days, and then declared her to be acceptable, which Alice and Thomas agreed was more than many siblings managed in the first week. Abigail Cooper, who had become so entirely woven into the fabric of the rocking bee and of Alice's life that to imagine the place without her was to imagine something deeply diminished, looked at the baby Eleanor and said, "Well, she's going to be trouble," in the tone of profound approval. "Like her mother," Thomas said. "I was never any trouble," Alice said. Thomas and Abigail looked at each other with the identical expression of two people maintaining composure in the presence of a remarkable claim. "Not intentional trouble," Alice amended, which satisfied neither of them but which she stood by. The school at the Rocking Bee had become by 1883 something that was known in the county, not as an institution in the formal sense, but in the way that good things in small communities become known, through the children who came out of it capable and curious, and through the families who saw the change in those children and spoke about it to other families. Dorothy Marsh had married one of the Hartley boys, which Alice found both appropriate and amusing, and she had moved to a house 2 miles down the road but continued to teach at the school. And a third teacher had been brought in for the growing enrollment, a man named Franklin Cross, who had come from Ohio with a teaching certificate and a profound interest in geography that aligned so neatly with Alice's own view of that subject's importance that she had hired him before the end of the first interview. Thomas, watching this growth with the same careful attention he gave to the cattle operation, built a proper schoolhouse in 1883. Not a converted shed, but a real schoolhouse, with 4 windows and a stove and proper benches made by a craftsman in Caldwell, who did the work for a price Alice negotiated herself. The schoolhouse sat 200 yards from the main house of the rocking bee, and it gleamed in the Kansas light. And on the first day of school after it was completed, Alice stood in the doorway and looked out across the flat, beautiful land, and then back at the room, at the benches and the blackboard and the windows and the good stove, and felt something she could only describe as a rightness, the feeling of a thing being what it was always supposed to be. Thomas came and stood beside her in the doorway, which was what he did. He came and stood beside her. "Good," he said. "Perfect," she said. He put his arm around her shoulders and she leaned into the solid warmth of him, and they looked at the schoolhouse together in the September morning light, and from somewhere behind the hill one of the cattle made its large and unreflective contribution to the morning noise, and they both laughed, and it was the kind of laugh that belongs to a life that has found its shape. James Bancroft, who was now 4, appeared from around the corner of the schoolhouse at a run, covered in some substance that was probably mud but was possibly something worse, and he arrived at his father's legs and grabbed them with both hands and looked up and said, "Papa, there's a frog," with the confident assumption that this information would be of immediate and significant interest to everyone present. Thomas looked at Alice. Alice looked at Thomas. "There's a frog," Thomas agreed solemnly. "We should investigate," Alice said with the same gravity. James led them around the corner of the schoolhouse to the frog, which was large and sat by the water trough with the self-possession of a creature that had considered its situation and found it entirely adequate. James regarded it with scientific intensity. Thomas crouched down to his son's level and pointed out its particular qualities with the same patience and attentiveness he brought to everything he cared about, and Alice stood behind them in the September light and thought about a stagecoach and a dusty street and 14 cents, and the feeling of being looked at without laughter by the one person who chose not to. And she thought about how that moment, that single unremarkable moment of one man touching his hat brim across a street, had contained within it the improbable and complete and continuing fact of this life. Eleanor, who was a year old and in Abigail's arms nearby, seemed to have opinions about the frog. She expressed them. The frog departed. The years moved through the rocking bee with the particular quality of years in which things are genuinely good, which is that they are full and various and marked by the small accumulations of an existence that is loved and tended, the way good land is loved and tended. The children grew. James Bancroft developed the mathematical precision of a man who was going to manage something large and complicated, which his father observed with a satisfaction he tried not to show too obviously, and which Alice noted with the additional satisfaction of recognizing Sam Dillon's influence on her own view of mathematical minds. Eleanor Bancroft developed the kind of stubborn and exuberant personality that Abigail Cooper had predicted, and which expressed itself, Alice noted with some maternal recognition, in the direction of fierce personal conviction and general refusal to let injustice pass unremarked, which was, everyone agreed, entirely her mother's doing. Sam Dillon wrote from Kansas City every few months. His letters grew from the brief and practical communications of a 13-year-old boy to the lengthier and increasingly impressive correspondence of a young man who was becoming, in ways even he seemed to find surprising, a person of considerable mathematical consequence. He said in every letter that he remembered the schoolroom and the books and Alice's decision to see what he could do, and Alice kept his letters in the writing desk in the east bedroom, the room that had been hers when she first came to the rocking bee, and which was now the room in which she wrote her lesson plans and her correspondence, and sometimes, in the evenings when the children were asleep, sat and read by lamplight with Thomas nearby, doing his accounts, and neither of them needing to say anything because the company itself was enough. Me Cooper, who grew into exactly the person her ferocious 11-year-old intelligence had promised, went east to a women's college at 17, an event that her mother Abigail accepted with pride and a briskness that barely concealed an emotion she would not have named in public. She wrote to Alice regularly, and Alice wrote back, and the correspondence between them had the quality of two people who had recognized in each other a particular kind of mind, and continued to take pleasure in its exercise across distance. Little Clara Bishop, who had cried at compliments, became in her teens a young woman of considerable poise and considerable warmth who taught Sunday school, and who could be seen most mornings doing something quietly useful for someone who needed it, which was exactly, Alice thought, what you would have predicted if you had known her at 6 years old and had been paying the right kind of attention. Caldwell changed, as the cattle towns did, as the decade turned and the great drives began their long and inevitable winding down. The town grew more sedate and less theatrical, which was a loss of color and a gain of safety, and Alice thought the exchange was probably worth it on balance, though she found she missed the particular wildness of the early days, the rawness of a world that was genuinely uncertain, and in the process of becoming something, which had been frightening but also alive in a way that settled certainty never quite matched. The rocking bee did not diminish with the drives. Thomas had built it to be more than a way station for trail cattle, and it stood on its own water and its own land, and the winter of 1886, which was catastrophic for many operators in the territory, took a toll but left the essential structure intact, because Thomas had prepared for the possibility of disaster with the same care he brought to the possibility of success. They came through it, and they came through it together, which Alice thought was perhaps the simplest and most complete thing she could say about their marriage. They came through everything together. In 1888, on a September morning, exactly 10 years after Alice had stepped off a stagecoach in Caldwell with a mended sleeve and 14 cents, and a heart full of carefully maintained courage, she stood on the porch of the rocking bee in the September light that was exactly the same gold and particular light that September always brought to the Kansas plain, and she watched her husband come in from the east pasture on the dun horse's successor, a gray horse named by James, who had loved one of the ranch hand's gray cats and found the color loyally appealing, and she watched James himself coming from the direction of the barn with a bucket that he carried with the determined stride of a 7-year-old who has been given a useful task and is executing it with maximum commitment, and she could hear Elinor's voice from somewhere inside the house, informing Abigail Cooper of something with great conviction, and she thought about all of it, the whole enormous small sum of it. Thomas pulled up beside the porch and looked down at her from the saddle with those October Creek eyes that had not changed in 10 years, except to deepen slightly in the way that the feelings behind them had deepened. "Good morning," he said. "Good morning," she said. He dismounted and came up the porch steps and kissed her in the easy, certain way of a man who has been doing this for 10 years and intends to continue doing it indefinitely, and Alice kissed him back with the same certainty, and from inside the house Elinor was still informing Abigail of something, and James arrived at the porch with his bucket and said, "Papa, the north water trough is getting low," which was a useful and practical piece of information, and Thomas said, "Good notice, James," in the voice he used when he meant both the words and something larger behind them, and James went inside satisfied. "I have been thinking," Alice said, as she often began, "about the school." Thomas settled into the chair beside her with the ease of a man at home in his own existence. "Tell me," he said. She had been thinking about expanding the school, properly formalizing it, approaching the county about making it an official district school rather than a private one, which would bring more resources and more oversight, both of which she thought were worth having. She had been drafting a proposal for the past week, and it was nearly ready to present. Thomas listened to all of it as he always had, with genuine attention and genuine thought, and he asked 3 specific questions that were the right 3 specific questions, and then he said, "When do you want to present it to the county?" "October," she said. "I want to bring it in person." "I'll come with you," he said. Not to speak for her, she knew that without needing it stated, but because they went places together, which was a different and particular thing. "Yes," she said. "I want you there." Abigail appeared at the door. "Eleanor has knocked a preserves jar off the shelf in the pantry," she reported, with the composure of a woman for whom this was a known variety of event, "and is now explaining to the jar why it fell." Alice and Thomas looked at each other with the exact same expression. "She's explaining to the jar," Alice said. "She has her mother's sense of justice," Thomas said, which was not the first time he had said this and would not be the last. Alice stood up from the chair and went inside to attend to the jar and the explanation, and she walked through the house that was solidly and genuinely theirs, through the kitchen and the hallway, and into the pantry where Eleanor, 3 years old and red-faced with the effort of her reasoning, was indeed addressing a jar of plum preserves that had rolled against the baseboard with its contents intact. Abigail, Alice noticed, had been leaning in the pantry doorway watching this with an expression of deep, private delight. "Eleanor," Alice said. Eleanor looked up. "Mama, it fell wrong," she said, with the certainty of a child who has located the cause of the problem. "I see that," Alice said. She crouched down to Eleanor's level. "What would you like to do about it?" Eleanor considered this. "Put it back," she said, "and tell it not to fall again." "That is a reasonable plan," Alice said. She helped Eleanor put the jar back, and Eleanor told the jar in measured terms that it should stay where it was put, and the jar offered no counter-argument. Alice lifted her daughter and held her for a moment, the solid warmth of her in the September morning, and she pressed her lips to the top of Eleanor's dark head and smelled the good, clean smell of a child who has been outside already this morning and has opinions about preserves jars. And she thought about all the things she had not known to hope for when she was 22 years old with 14 cents and a carpet bag, and a courage she was holding together with both hands. She had not known to hope for this particular thing, which was life itself in its most full and generous form. She had not known to hope for a man who would see her across a street and not laugh. She had not known to hope for a schoolroom that changed children who changed the world in small and real ways. She had not known to hope for a daughter who delivered moral reasoning to preserves jars, or a son who noticed water troughs, or a friend in Abigail Cooper who had shown up on a horse one October morning and offered her another road. She put Eleanor down and straightened up in the pantry and looked out the small window at the flat September sky over the Kansas plain, and she thought, "I know how to hope for it now. I know exactly what it looks like." Thomas appeared in the pantry doorway, ducking slightly for the frame because he was always slightly too tall for doorways designed by optimistic builders, and he looked at his wife and his daughter and the successfully replaced jar of plum preserves, and he said, "Everything resolved." "Everything resolved," Alice confirmed. Eleanor held up her arms to her father, and Thomas lifted her with the practiced ease of a man for whom this gesture was as natural as breathing, and he carried her out of the pantry and down the hall toward the sound of James somewhere outside, and Alice stood in the pantry doorway for one more moment and listened to the rocking bee around her. The sound of her children and her husband and Abigail in the kitchen, the cattle somewhere in the east pasture, the September wind coming across the flat and beautiful land, everything she had, which was everything. She went out of the pantry and into the kitchen and put on the coffee, and the day continued, real and full and hers. That evening they sat on the porch in the September dark, she and Thomas, as they had sat on porches for 10 years. And the stars were out in the extravagant Kansas way, and James had been put to bed after a long and involved negotiation about whether frogs could be considered educational material and therefore extend bedtime, and Eleanor had gone to sleep mid-sentence, which was how Alina always went to sleep, her opinion not quite completed, deferred to morning. The prairie was quiet and vast and cold-edged with the first intimation of the season to come, and Alice thought about a girl stepping off a stagecoach with the sound of laughter around her and the sound of one man's silence, and about how that silence had been a language she had read correctly from the first moment. "Thomas," she said. "Yes," he said, in the tone of a man who has been answering this particular invocation for 10 years and finds it consistently worth answering. "Thank you," she said, "for not laughing." He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "Thank you for looking up." She reached out in the dark and found his hand where it rested on the arm of the chair, and he turned his hand and held hers, and they sat together in the enormous quiet of the Kansas night, and there was nothing left open, nothing unresolved, nothing that needed to be said that had not been said, nothing that needed to be done that had not been done. There was only the continuing and sufficient and daily fact of a life that had been found in the most unlikely and precise of ways, by a woman who had stepped off a stagecoach in September and lifted her chin and looked across a dusty street, and found on the other side of it a man who was already looking back. The stars burned above the flat and indifferent and magnificent land. The cattle shifted in the dark pasture. From inside the house came the sound of Abigail putting out the last lamp, the small domestic click of something well cared for being completed for the night. Thomas's hand was warm and real in hers. The September air moved across the porch like something breathing. Alice Langston Bancroft was home.